Dodge Billingsley, Director of Combat Films and Research, began covering conflict in 1993, work that has taken him to many wars in contested regions, including Bosnia, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Peru, Bolivia, Eastern Turkey, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Western China, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Chechnya. Dodge spends his time between documentary film, writing, lecturing, and consulting. Happily, some of that with us. He recently co-authored Operation Anaconda, America's first major battle in Afghanistan, which is forthcoming this fall 2011. And he was among the few on the ground to document the U.S.-led Operation Anaconda in Afghanistan's Shah-e-Khat Valley in 2002. You perhaps have heard him speak about that here before. He has traveled in and out of the Caucasus many times since 1993 and is currently writing a book on Chechen tactics for the U.S. Marine Corps based on dozens of first-person interviews collected from Chechen combat veterans. He's also producing a film on the Korean Peninsula, the latest in our Beyond the Border series of documentary films. If you're familiar with that or not, you can go to our website at beyondtheborder.org to explore all of those. Previous programs in that series have included Chechnya, Separatism or Jihad, and Global Car, which is our most recent one. In 2003, he was a finalist for the prestigious Rory Peck Award for Best Feature for his film Virgin Soldiers, which follows a squad of Marines during Operation Iraqi Freedom 1. In 2002, Dodge Billingsley won the Rory Peck Award and Royal Television Society Award for Best Feature for House of War, which documented the battle for Kwalajangi Fortress in Afghanistan, where he was one of the few foreigners on hand at the prisoner revolt that unfortunately took the life of CIA agent Mike Spann. He's lectured extensively on Chechnya, Afghanistan, Iraq, and conflict in general since 2003, has also been a member of the faculty at the Naval Postgraduate School's Leadership Development and Education for Sustained Peace program, and regularly briefs U.S. and NATO partner military units prior to their deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, just recently in Poland for a quick one-day trip. A recipient of the MacArthur Regional Security Travel Grant for his work in Abkhazia, he's a frequent contributor to various defense and security-related journals, including Jane's Intelligence Review and the Harriman Review. An avid collector of socialist and social realist art, his extensive collection has been exhibited in various public and university museums. Billingsley received a BA in History from Columbia University and an MA in War Studies from King's College Department of War Studies in London. His presentation today, Ordinary Men, a profile of the Chechen insurgents and their tactics. Please join me in welcoming back to the Kennedy Center, Dodge Billingsley.
It is great to be here at the Kennedy Center today, and I'm glad it's today and not tomorrow, because I think we'll all be watching or gearing up to watch the game. It's been pretty exciting. I have to say, my wife cut our cable months ago, so I never had a chance to see this guy Jimmer play, and until the tournament. And I'm like, yeah, he's pretty good, and so that's a good thing. But Chechnya, I've spoken here at this podium before on Chechnya, and I'm going to speak about it again because I'm wrapping up a book on it, as Corey mentioned. So I want to go through, and I'll sort of take you through the process a little bit, and I'm going to refer to some things on the slide on the screen during the process. The basic question, who are the Chechens? And if you look at the common or the scholarship out there, you have a wide range. Murphy's book, Wolves of Islam, and Bodansky's book, I can't even see it here, Chechen Jihad, sort of paint the Chechens as all jihadis, Salafi Wahhabi jihadis, who are fighting part of the global war for Islamic Caliphate in the area, as one of many areas around the world. And that is one way to see the Chechens, and that's an okay way to see the Chechens. You also, on the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, you have the Chechen Struggle, Independence, Won and Lost, Ilyas Akhmadov's new book. His first book, it just came out a couple months ago. An insider's look. He was when I say foreign minister of Chechnya, obviously they're not a recognized country, but they consider themselves a country. They had a foreign minister, Ilyas Akhmadov, after serving and fighting in the First War, became the foreign minister for Chechnya, and he went out to Baku and then to Paris, and he now lives in the United States. Thank you to John McCain and a few other people who really pushed him through getting him cleared to be here. And he gives a different look of a different sense of what Chechnya is all about, an independence struggle. Yes, we're Islamic, we're Sufis, we're not Wahhabis, we're not Salafi Wahhabis. We have our own traditions. They're sort of a fusion of our own culture plus Islamic belief. And then you have, and you can't really see this is one of the Beyond the Border series that Corey mentioned that's called Chechnya, Separatism or Jihad, which we built this show a few years ago. We wanted to ask that basic question. What is it? And who are these Chechens? Are they separatists, or are they all jihadists? And frankly, does it matter? It's interesting also to look and see how the Chechens view themselves. And if you look at their two primary websites, Chechen Press and the Kavkaz Center, you get two very radically different views. This is the more nationalist site, which, yes, it's independent Chechnya. They want to be independent from Russia. They totally support this claim through culture and through Islam, through their religion. But it's completely different than Kavkaz Center, which, if you look at the headlines, you can't really see them on here, but they're very anti-American. They're anti the West. In fact, they're really harping on everything we're doing in Libya right now. And they relish when the U.S. soldiers get killed in Afghanistan. And it's run by a Chechen named Mevlady Udugov, who lives in Istanbul, and he's surrounded himself with a bunch of Arab Wahhabis, and that's the sort of protection, his shell. And he runs the center out of Istanbul. And they claim to be, you'll see the current president of Chechnya is actually Doku Umarov, who's just living up in the mountains with his 200 or 300 fighters, and they'll, run these communiques for Doku Umarov. And so that's the different view you get. And so depending on what you kind of feel, or if you're doing research on Chechnya, you can actually look and get a kind of a nationalist picture or a real jihadist picture. So even amongst the Chechens themselves, this is a big deal. This is a big split. Now let's back up just a second, because I don't want to take for granted that everybody knows about Chechnya, in fact, where it is. It's in the Caucasus. It's the area between the Black Sea, and over here would be the Caspian Sea. And it's right here, sandwiched between Dagestan and Ingushetia, north of Georgia. And one of the significant features, land features, that makes Chechnya unique is this mountain range right here, the Caucasus Mountains, stretching up to about 22,000 feet in some of the high peaks. It's a natural defensive barrier. Every country wants this kind of barrier. And this is a primary reason Russia will never, in my opinion, never consider letting any of these republics on the north slope of these mountains go. They're not going to do it. Why? Because if you let these go into independent countries or semi-autonomous regions or autonomous regions, basically those influences that create these countries are down into the Russian breadbasket. They just move right down up north into the Russian breadbasket. Having a geographical border like the Caucasus mountain range and only 2 or 3 functional passes open year-round is a fantastic defensive barrier. You're not going to invade Russia through the Caucasus Mountains. I mean, it's hard. You have the Roki Tunnel here in Ossetia, North Ossetia, and a few other areas. But that's a primary stumbling block, in my opinion, as to why this debate for Chechnya continues. Here's a close-up map of Chechnya. This is the city of Grozny. Grozny was originally a Russian fortress. It means terrible. And it's translated, it was terrible. It was not built upon an existing Chechen village when it was built 300 years ago. So it's kind of a true Russian city as far as many of the Chechens are concerned. In fact, if you talk to Chechens, they all will tell you they come from a certain village. And that technically is true. There were no urbanized Chechens, obviously, in the beginning because there were no urban centers. So when the war started, lots of the Chechens ran down into the protection of these mountains here, into these little villages, and there's tons and tons of little villages in here, and carried on the fight. Just to give you a few basic, points, the Chechen War, the first one, you could say started in November of 1994. If you remember, maybe you don't remember, they declared independence in 1991, but things just kept spiraling out of control. And in 1994, the Russians first tried to take over and overthrow the Dudayev regime in the summer of 94 using pro-Moscow Chechens and backed up by Russian tanks and Russian tank crews. They denied it. The Chechens, of course, paraded the Russian prisoners on TV, global TV, and it was there for everyone to see. These were Russian tank crews. And they actually had their unit numbers and everything. But there was a significant battle for Grozny in December, starting New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1994, going into January 1st. The Chechens left Grozny after 2 or 3 months. This man here, Shamil Basayev, who I lived with for a time up in his home in Vadino, he led a raid into Budenovsk in May of 1995 and sequestered himself and his group into a hospital. They took about 1,300 hostages, and they fought off Russian special forces advances for 3 days, finally negotiating a truce and a ceasefire in Chechnya. And then they were able to negotiate with the hostages to be human shields, and they drove them back into Chechnya, and he became a national hero because he basically stopped the Russian war because they declared the ceasefire. And in reality, the Chechens used the ceasefire to rebuild, regroup, until they led an assault on the capital again in March for a 3-day assault. The only intention was, let's just show everybody that we can take it. They took positions. They basically captured every position in the capital for 3 days and then left after 3 days. But again, and then the Russians went after them again. But in August 1996, they did the same thing, and that time they said, we're sticking, and they just stayed. And they either killed or captured every single Russian unit and soldier in the Grozny area. And at that point, the Russians just threw up their hands and said, we've had enough. You want autonomy, you got it. And they came up with the Kosovo Agreement, which would basically settle true independence or true status later, but basically Russian troops left Chechnya. They went into the interwar period, which was a complete fiasco, a complete mess. Chechens were unified up and through 1996. They were unified in their hatred of Russia, in their belief that they had to overthrow and defeat the Russian forces. Once the Russian forces were gone, the Chechens splintered amongst themselves. It had never been a functioning, let's just say a westernized army, a modern army with actual protocol, with rules of engagement. This was a group of, in some cases, it would run more like an army, in other cases, run like a gang. And these different warlords fought each other continually. And if you look at the interwar period from 96 to 99, Chechen warlords are battling it out all the time. I mean, there's gunfights in the city of Grozny. I mean, not gunfights, but like armored fights in the city of Grozny between rival Chechen groups and the president, or in Gudermes between Wahhabis and more nationalists. So you see this sort of splintering. Kidnapping was unbelievable. When we were there in 97, I mean, it was, let's put it this way, there were no Westerners that made it out. We made it in and out in one other set between 96 and 99. Every other group that went in there was either kidnapped and killed, or kidnapped and ransomed. It's very dangerous, which is why I ended up living with Shamil Basayev, because my personal safety net told me that if I'm not with kind of the baddest of the bad, you will not come out of Chechnya alive. In fact, and so that's what we did. We used contacts, and we had known Shamil's guys from earlier wars in the region, and we put it through their network, and then that's how we ended up staying with Shamil Basayev. I just simply wouldn't risk it. And one of the problems with reporting in Chechnya between 96 and 99, it was too dangerous. It wasn't worth it, because there was like a 99% chance you would never come out of there, ever. And it was bad. It was really bad. Our interpreter, we picked up a black Muslim from Guinea to be our interpreter, who was wanting to do a documentary on the Chechens, and he stayed longer than us, and he was kidnapped after we left, and he was thrown in a pit, which is traditional. They all have like a root cellar, like a trap door through their kitchen in the villages, and they just threw him in this pit for like all winter long, and they'd throw him scraps of food. But they had an Ossetian man in there too, and it's purely a money play. This Ossetian man's brother was a businessman in Vladikavkaz. So what they did is they took them both out, and they scared them by shooting, rounds close to their head and stuff. But they cut the Ossetian guy's ear off and mailed it to his brother in Vladikavkaz, and it got the ransom, and that's how they funded their war effort in reality. And so you had another split amongst the Chechens: those who funded through kidnapping, and those who funded through some of their friends. And this is Al-Khattab, a Saudi or Jordanian. I don't know. No one seems to know. He was fighting as a jihadist in Tajikistan, heard about the Chechen cause, came to Chechnya. He brought with him a handful of Arab fighters. This has been hotly debated ever since then. What's the role and influence of these jihadi forces, these Arabs? And honestly, there were never more, almost everybody will tell you, well, some people will say, the Russians will tell you there's thousands of these guys. There were never more than probably 80 to 90 at any given time in Chechnya, four jihadists. But their influence was beyond their numbers. They brought with them money. They didn't bring weapons. They didn't need weapons, because the Chechens basically could get their weapons from the Russians. And this seems hard to believe, but it's honestly true. They basically bought weapons from Russian units all through the First War. That's how they supplied themselves with weapons. But they basically do is cut a deal at a Russian garrison. Sell us this truckload of Mukhas, it's a single fire rocket launcher. They'd make a deal to buy a truckload of these weapons. With the agreement, they would never attack this block post. So then they use it against all other Russian block posts in the region. And so Russians on the tactical line on the front were cutting deals all the time with the Chechens, and the Chechens were cutting deals with the Russians. But what they didn't have was money. The Arabs brought money. They also brought the Quran. But it's interesting, he wouldn't talk to us because we weren't Muslim and we were Americans. And he goes, the infidel, and if it was my way, we'd behead you right here, and we'd be done with it. But Shamil Basayev interceded on my behalf and said, no, you can't behead them. They're here under, my arrangement, so it's an honor thing. But what was interesting, he would talk to our interpreter, Alpha Diallo Abubakar, this Guinea translator we had. And he told him, he goes, oh, you speak English? And Alpha says, yeah, I speak English. He goes, so they would converse in English because he didn't want the Chechens to understand what he was saying either. And so he'd go, man, I hate these Chechens. They're the worst Muslims ever. All they care about is money and violence. And he goes, the other thing is, if I don't constantly seek out Russian targets, even in this peace period, and attack them and show that I'm strong, Chechens will take me out. I mean, he had 3 schools in Surjan Yurt, a little area going up to Vidino, where he taught basic Arabic, he taught the Quran. They weren't madrasas, they weren't attached to a mosque, they were more like training camps, because they all taught military fundamentals too. Only a handful of Chechens went through them, but all of his volunteers from the International Arab Brigades had to go through them. And there's been hundreds that have rotated through, but again, at any given time, there's probably 80 or 90 max. In fact, there were more, coincidentally, more Ukrainian volunteers in Chechnya than there were Arabs. And that seems a little weird. Maybe it doesn't. These are Ukrainians from Western Ukraine. They hate the Russians. They only went to Chechnya because they thought, we can fight Russians here. So there was an entire Chechen battalion in Grozny assigned to Salman Raduyev, and they wore these, they looked like Nazis actually. They were all black, and they had a white patch with a red cross, Ukrainian cross, and they were actually actively engaged against the Russians for the entire duration of the First War. Very strange mix over there. And then you had a handful of Americans there, but not that many. The Second War started in 1999, September. Basically, a couple of different things happened, but in a nutshell, Shamil Basayev, his friend Khattab, they decide with a handful of others to take their Islamic brigade, and they invade Dagestan, the neighboring republic. This is all the pretext Russia needs. Talk to Chechens today, they're hotly divided on this. The Russians duped us into this. No, Shamil just lost and became a Salafi Wahhabi, and he killed us. He basically gave us, it's a death sentence for all of us now. They're totally divided on why Shamil went in, and Shamil's dead, Khattab's dead, they can't talk to these guys anymore, but they went into Dagestan. Russia comes back hard. They start the war with Yeltsin, but soon Putin takes over, and then the war becomes a completely different game. It was brutal in the First War. In the First War, Russia, if you recall from maybe one of your political science courses, this is history now, but the CFE agreements at the end of the Cold War said that Russia had to bring out all their weapons out of a number of their weapons and arms stockpile out of Eastern Europe. Basically, the Russians said, ship it to Chechnya. Observers that were in Sarajevo said that although 2,000 or 3,000 shells a day would land in Sarajevo during the height, they were saying that 10,000 shells an hour were landing in Grozny. And when I went to Grozny, I didn't know I was in Grozny because you go past the belt of suburbs and into the middle, and it's just, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. They flattened all of inside the interior part of downtown Grozny, just gone. It's just a piece of rebar and dust where the cement used to, what the cement used to be. And then the Chechens, of course, have scavenged everything to rebuild homes and stuff around the periphery. There was no central Grozny after like 1995, 96. It was amazing. Anyway, 2 big episodes. January 1st of 2000, actually that's wrong. January 31st, February 1st, the Chechens decide they're going to leave Grozny again. They gather 4,000 Chechens with all 19 field commanders, and they come out. They're just going to walk out. They do what they call tactical withdrawal. They get caught in a minefield. The minefield alerts the Russians. The Russians artillery fire. They lose about 600 soldiers going through the minefield and 9 of 16 field commanders. This, in my opinion, was the death blow to the Chechen insurgency because you lost 9 of your 16 field commanders, most of your nationalists. In other words, the guys who had fought in the First War, Aslanbek Jr., Aslanbek Sr., Shamil Basayev had his leg amputated to the knee. You lost Lecha Dudayev. You lost a number of these guys who were your sort of separatist nationalist Chechens, the ones that I would say the West could deal with, not that the West would deal with them, but I mean, you could work with these guys. They were just more like, they were just separatists. 2 months later, Ruslan Galayev, who was another notable field commander, puts out a distress call in the city of Komsomolsky, where he's from, and it gets misinterpreted, and all the Chechens, about 2,000 Chechens show up in that city thinking they need to help him out and fight, and the Russians basically attack and wipe them out and kill about 1,000 Chechens. So between these two events in January and March of 2000, I'd say basically half or a third of the Chechen fighting forces wiped out, which leads to an elevation of your younger commanders, because so many of your older commanders are dead, or like Shamil laid up with, trying to work with a prosthetic limb and try to, get back to being a fighter. This is a big deal. Anyway, the war goes on. The president, Aslan Maskhadov, is killed, and Shamil Basayev is killed. Doku Umarov becomes the president, and he's the current president today. He was a junior field commander for Galayev during the First War, like a lieutenant. And then he became like a lieutenant colonel. I mean, I'm just throwing these names out there, these titles out there, because in reality, here a battalion means something. In Chechnya, it can mean 10 guys or 200 guys, depending on who you were, and if they decide to go home for, Ramadan or something. I mean, it's constant. It was very flexible. So I've kind of given you a little bit of the background on this, and I wanted to be sure and let you know where the perspective I'm coming from. Obviously, I've indicated that I've been in Chechnya. This is kind of my history when it relates to Chechnya. In '93, I traveled to the Republic of Georgia, and there was a fight there in a place called Abkhazia. And what was interesting to me is everybody kept talking about the Chechens. And in '93, honestly, I didn't know I had never heard of them before, never. And everybody said, man, these Chechens they're winning the war for us. Or on the Georgian side, the Georgians would say, gosh, these Chechens, let's go around them. It's not worth it. And so their kind of reputation started, and that's where Shamil Basayev was, and that's where Ruslan Galayev, where they had these two battalions. So I started talking about all this stuff, and made a bunch of different trips into Abkhazia. And then during this war, I was in graduate school, so I missed it. And I look back, and I can't decide if it was a good thing or a bad thing. I think I probably should have taken a semester off and gone to the war in Chechnya, because I'd been to all the other wars in the region, and all of a sudden this was like the granddaddy, and I was like, it was really hard to study. But I did go there in 1997, and we produced this first film, Immortal Fortress. And I'll be honest, it's a look at the Chechens, and I've been fascinated by, one, how they see themselves, two, how they see their enemies, the Russians, and just what makes a Chechen. I mean, there's really fascinating, like they all are keenly aware, whether it happened or not, and I think it did happen, but the Mongol invasion. They even recall fighting Tamerlane before the Mongol invasion. And Tamerlane got as far as the outskirts of Moscow, so I mean, I guess he went through Chechnya, I don't know. Also, very interesting oral traditions in Chechnya about being a tribe of Israel, what we would call one of the lost 10 tribes, which is really bizarre to me. Makes sense. I mean, they could have walked north from, whatever. I mean, they didn't become Islamic until the Ottomans, they didn't become Muslim people until the Ottoman Empire, washed over the area. So they had hundreds of centuries, and I mean, hundreds of years, not hundreds of centuries, hundreds of years, sort of become who they were up in the mountains there before Islam ever reached them. But not a lot more is known about them. They don't have a written language. It was their language is written with Russian Cyrillic characters. They used that to write their language, but in fact, since the First War, there's been a big effort to put a language together, but it's kind of, but they do speak Chechen. I'll talk about that in a minute. What was interesting to me is after 9/11, I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan and then Iraq, and everywhere I went, I heard about these Chechens who are kicking the crap out of us or something. And the fact of the matter is, there are no Chechens in Afghanistan or Iraq. I can't say there's not a single one, but I actually probably I would bet most that I have that there's not a single one. If you look at Russian propaganda toward the Chechens, they've been really big since Tolstoy of declaring the Chechens have been like, if you do something, if your child does something wrong and you're a Russian mom, you're going to tell her the Chechen's going to get her in the night. It's like a boogeyman story. I've heard Russians talk about this for a decade. And this has gone back all the way to Tolstoy, this idea these Chechens are like, they're bad people. Talking to a friend of mine who's a CIA not Alpha Team, he was Alpha Team, the Uzbek team that worked with the Uzbeks in Afghanistan. And we were on these battlefields, and there'd be a bunch of dead Taliban or whoever, and there'd be these Northern Alliance guys that would be walking around, and they'd be like, Yemeni, Chechen, Arab, and then these guys are disfigured and mangled because we dropped a J-dam on them. And I'm like, do these guys have any clue, really, who these bodies? They go, nah, no way. He goes, and they always say a Chechen whenever they see someone remotely light-skinned, but every time we look them up or figure it out, they're Uzbeks. They're from the IMU. They're from the Fergana Valley. He goes, the Chechens basically is a bad word. If you have a bad person and you're in Afghanistan, you call them a Chechen. But this has led to some real interesting reporting, like 50 Chechens threw themselves off a bridge and committed suicide in Kunduz in November of 2001, which is just absolutely ridiculous. And I remember when that story came across, Northern Alliance passed it to the news crews there at Mazar-e Sharif where we were. And I said to the guard, I said, you probably, that's not right. That's just not right. It's just so out of character with the Chechens. He goes, how do you know? I'm like, well, I've spent enough time there to know that if the Chechens are going to commit suicide, they're going to take a lot of their enemy out with them. There's just no way they're just going to jump in the river and commit death. It doesn't make any sense. Plus, to get 50 Chechens in Afghanistan in November of 2001, they couldn't even organize 50 Chechens in their own mountains. They just don't have that kind of number of resources. It's the false story. Guardian printed it and went global. You can still look it up on Google or something. But these sort of these stories came up over and over. Anyway, so many stories, in fact, that I decided that I ought to do a book on Chechen tactics and who these people are that are fighting. And I pitched it out. And the first group that came out, well, let's put it this way. The CIA said they were interested in it as a white paper. And I said, no, I can't work, no way, because that'll just be misconstrued and I'll end up beheaded in a ditch somewhere. And the Marines were interested as well, and so is Kansas University Press for their Modern Warfare series. So I think we're publishing it for them and for the Marine Corps. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Basically, what I did is I went back through and I started contacting all the Chechens that I knew. Now, they'd been kind of going all over the place, and so I had a couple just basic things. But when I get to a location like Azerbaijan, where there was at any given, there was probably 30,000 Chechen refugees in Baku or the surrounding area, around 1999, now there's about 6,000 for two reasons. The Russians are hunting these guys down at a fairly fast clip, and so everyone's really scared, and they're going deep underground, and they're doing whatever they can to immigrate to the West. And then a lot of them just disappear off the street, and that was a problem we had. We do a group interview sometimes, like I remember one time we went into a strange little place in Azerbaijan, and 15 Chechens met up because they had gotten the word from one of my friends that vouched for me, one of the Chechen friends that I'd known from before. And we started talking through. In the end, only 4 of the 15 decided they wanted to risk being interviewed. Of course, the challenges, we put very few people on camera. A couple wanted to be on camera, kind of want to put it in the Russians' face. I always try to do these things on camera as well because we're talking about multiple language issues. One of the things that drove me absolutely crazy is my Russian's terrible, and I took a Russian translator here from BYU, Glenn Doxey. He's a brilliant Russian, a brilliant linguist, a brilliant Russian speaker. But they keep bouncing back from Chechen to Russian. And Glenn would just get this dazed look on his face. And I'm like, I'm following along or trying to. And then he'd go, I don't know what's going on. And we're like, dude, you got to stop talking. You can't speak to us in Chechen. We can't translate it. And so they'd back up. And I was surprised at how prevalent the Chechen language still was amongst these guys. Another problem was that we just happened to get our contract and start working when the war broke out in Georgia in 2008. And we were in the area in Georgia and Azerbaijan, and when the war happened, the Chechens just went, boom, they just disappeared. From day to night, they were gone. And I met up with them a little bit later. I'm like, what happened? They go, man, the Russians are coming south of the mountains. We're hiding. We're all hiding out. They were just physically afraid. There was also a batch of Chechens that, I didn't realize this, and they said it, and I was checking with a friend of mine who works for the Georgian Ministry of Defense, and apparently the Chechens then made their calls to the Georgians and said, hey, you want us to help you out against the Russians? And the Georgians were politely declining. No, we don't want to, this will really escalate into something we don't want, and no thanks. But so that really hurt us a little bit. The other thing was there were some high-profile killings. Yamadayev, a Chechen who was in exile in Dubai, was assassinated in a parking garage. One of the guys we interviewed in Vienna was killed on the street shortly thereafter. And so then there was this idea that maybe they're tracking us through you. And so that was really difficult for us to work with. But so there's a number of challenges that we had. In the end, we only did 60 interviews. The sample was 60 interviews. 35 were long interviews, like 3, 4, 5-hour interviews. And of those 35, only 25 were really usable. And what I mean by that, and here's a sample, because we recorded it, we had an actual transcript of everything, but we'd take mad notes at the same time. And we learned a lot of words that we'd never learned before. You know, it's our vocabulary. We developed a whole vocabulary list of new words and things that, you know, again, we had to constantly fight through, like Sadakutur, I can't even say it, Sadakutur. They kept saying, we're like, what are you talking about? Well, it's the city of Komsomolsky, but it's just the ancient Chechen name for it. But it drove us crazy till we figured out what the heck they were talking about. So we kept thinking, why don't we know that Russian word? You know, so we're looking it up and we can't find it anywhere. Anyway, it was interesting. It was actually a lot of fun. The other thing we did was we asked them when they could to draw a map for us. I know Mapology is not a word, but I like it anyway. And so this is the black is their sketch. That's his sketch, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. So I had to go back through with my little terrible handwriting in red and indicate what in the world is he talking about. And then I'd do two things. I'd go to the topographical maps. There's a set of maps that I found from 1984 Soviet military maps that cover all of Chechnya. And I actually found the exact location right here. And then I put out some feelers and confirmed it. And you can't really see this, but this is the Google Earth image. And there's the crossroads, there's Chechenau, there's the Argun River, and there's the meatpacking facility right there where the battle took place. And there's the field. And if you look at Google Earth, you can't see it here, you'll see lots of you can see pock marks. You know, like there was a major action going on here. These buildings are all wiped out. And you can see a set of trench fortifications here, a set of trench fortifications here, and a set over here, which helps to verify. It's incredibly difficult to work with these guys for a couple of reasons. The other thing I want to talk about, bad memory and PTSD. I mean, these guys, for right or wrong, whether they're good or bad, right or wrong, they have gone through literally hell. I mean, you think about the average lifespan in Chechnya, the attrition rate of soldiers, of Chechen combatants, if you don't want to call them soldiers, it's very high. And the conditions from which they lived in. I mean, one group told me that they had, and 3 guys verified it in independent interviews, and they weren't all sitting together. So, I mean, I take it at face value when 3 people from the same group can tell me, but a group of 30 split a Snickers bar for 3 days. That's it. They each took a nibble one day, and they didn't eat again for 3 days, and that was a constant problem. Basically, food was the problem, food and supply. And they're in shock, and they have seen a lot of killing, and a lot of it they did, and a lot of it they saw, they got from the receiving end. And so they have very strange, and in fact, I've been debating this with a few other people. When I was in Georgia looking at the Abkhaz War, Georgia-Abkhazia, what I found was people who win can recount the tale quite well. People who lose and suffer had a much harder time. And I think there's an interesting study to be done there to look at combat reporting and look at the winners versus the losers. It's really hard to articulate. What I found, the Georgians could not, in 1994 and 5, articulate how they lost Abkhazia. They would stumble, they would have a hard time, they'd break out in a sweat, and then they'd just go, oh, the Russians beat us. And that was like sort of like that answer solved any question you have, the Russians beat us. It wasn't true. The Chechens and those guys were beaten up but the Chechens and the Abkhaz could relay the story. But I found that in fact, I felt bad for some of these guys. I told them, I think this is like tough love therapy for you, because some guys broke down while we were interviewing. You know, they're recalling memories of some of these events, just like, 20 guys went in and only 4 came out, and they were one of the 4. This is really hard for them. Or, one, losing family members, things like that. It was very difficult to get stories straight. But in the end, the interview and this map leads to a map like this for the book. And I'll just go, this is a typical action, holding the road to Shali in February or March. I don't know exactly when, because this was an ongoing position for a while. But they say they had 50 to 60 Chechens. If you look here, here's the 2-story building, the meat packing facility. The primary base camp right here of Chechens was they dug a trench along this road, sandwiched between the road and the river. And they sent some guys out here. And the Russians, meanwhile, were moving down from Grozny, and they moved into this field. They just broke off the road because they wanted to get down here across this road. If you see it here, here's the road, because it goes to Shali. All the Chechens were retreating out of the capital down another road here, and through Shali, down to Sergeant Yurt and into the mountains. If the Russians could cut them off and cut off Shali, they could trap 4,000 or 5,000 Chechen fighters and wipe them all out, and that was the plan. So they had to do these delaying actions, which is a fun, which when you think about Chechen tactics, there are some offensive actions, but in many cases, they're just fighting to delay the Russians' inevitable win. But what they did, as the Russians were moving on here, they also were really bored and undisciplined. And to hear them tell it, They were just bored. They couldn't believe they'd been sitting here and the Russians would mortar them. And they were tired of getting mortared, so they went up here on the 2-story building and they had some rocket launchers and they fired some rockets at this position. Now they're basically at max range for an RPG, so they don't even know if they hit anything. But it started a whirlwind of fire, and they just ran back here, their positions. And there's transposition, and trench position. In the end, the Russians did assault here. This is the symbol for mortars. This is the symbol for our heavy artillery. And they attacked in here, pushing the Chechens out of here. They ran this way, and they ran this way, and they suffer. One guy gets hit with shrapnel right here, just kind of takes his head off, and he's dead. So then they come back here, and they're fighting to save this spot. But the Russians, these are the red advance lines. They advance here, then they advance here, and force the Chechens across the river to another set of defensive positions, which they fight for another 2 weeks. In the end, they hold this road for about 4 or 5 weeks. This is a classic. This is really interesting because when you look at how the Russians fought, after taking such huge losses in Grozny in the first week of the war, they took huge losses in Grozny, like 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 dead in the first week or two. Because I think they went in thinking the Chechens, this will be a piece of cake, we'll just walk in, take the capital, be done. Well, 3 armored brigades went in, about 1.5 limped out. The others disappeared on the streets of Grozny. They went back to a very Russian, methodical way of fighting. You prep the space and you advance slowly. Russians did not take a lot of casualties. In reality, the Russians probably could have taken this whole thing in 1 day, but they took like 5 weeks to do it. They just weren't going to take the kind of casualties they did. That's what we think. There's been no Russian disclosure that that's why they moved so slow after the initial run into Grozny. But if you look at it, after the initial 3-brigade run, they really slowed down operations and pounded the Chechens with artillery, mortar, air power, and just beat them out that way. Here's another one. Unfortunately, you can't see the picture. Here's how a typical interview went. I just work with a map. You see the guy's hands, and we record his voice. That's it. This is actually the Battle of Goskaya in 1996. This is interesting because I had 3 or 4 people that actually were in this battle that they didn't know the other people who were in this battle. And that's because I didn't realize about 20 Russian Chechen units actually defended this place for 2 months. And so the Russians decided, hey, all the Chechens are here. They came over, again, mortar, artillery, air, helicopter, and attack aircraft. The Chechens shot down 2 helicopters and 1 plane. They thought they were doing pretty good. They built all these defensive positions all around here. Typical problem, the Russians, though, didn't seal off the back exits because the Chechens controlled Uders-Martin and this area here. So if you can't control the back, they first did an attack on April 3rd right up the middle along the canal, and they were beat back by the Chechens. The next day, they swung around to the left flank and to the right flank and actually entered the city and fought hand-to-hand and wiped out 2 Chechen positions here, but these circles represent reserve forces. I know this is really nerdy military stuff, sorry. My wife tells me I'm a war geek, but I think this stuff is pretty cool. These reserve units actually came back and held the line, but that night the Chechens had to then do mopping up operations because a number of Russian infantry were dismounted from their vehicles in the city, and they basically then had to clean up all the Russians out. So the Russians, this went on from basically March 28th to May 7th. The Russians did a final sweep and pushed them out. Oh, this is interesting here. Doku Umrov, the current president, he at the time, again, he was like a lieutenant or maybe a major at this time. He had maybe a company under his command. He was holding a position here, and when the Russians came around here and were fighting, he just hit them from behind and hit the Russians real hard here. And so this shows you the wiped out Russian tank and about, I think, 6 Russian bodies that were here in Goskaya, and there's all kinds of pictures of this event. But this is a typical map that we're using for the book and one of the battles that we're looking at. So these are some of the primary events that we looked at, that we were able to find in the interviews. And again, this was interesting because there were bits and pieces, but it was really hard for these guys to tell coherent stories. Time, memory. A lot of these guys have brain trauma. They have a lot of issues. But you get a sense of that a lot of these actions are defensive or delaying. The Chechens do a few things like ambush Russian column on the road to Vedino. But this whole ambush was just to stall them from getting to the Russians from getting to Vedino fast enough so they could move the command from Vedino deeper into the mountains. That was it. Now, they were actually very successful here. They wiped out 17 Russian vehicles. And what's interesting, when I was there in 97, that road is littered with Russian, like, the turret of a tank. And, I mean, there's tanks it's like it goes up a plane, and then there's a bunch of hairpin turns. On every turn, there's a Russian tank rolled over into the side, a burned out BTR, burned out BMP. way more than 17, but I guess they said that's from current, more and more Russian units moving in. But there's probably, I think I counted 43 Russian vehicles on the road from Surgeon Yurt up to Vodino. And that's staggering when you think of it, 47, vehicles. And the Chechens were good. I mean, they strip everything off those vehicles, and so it's just the shells that would remain. Things like this one, what's also really hard. Another thing I asked the Chechens, it goes back to the loser idea, is that these guys are they're not in Chechnya. I'm interviewing them in additional other countries. There's a reason they're out, right? Trying to get them to tell about a battle they lost is nearly impossible. They can't tell it. They can't verbalize it. It's very strange. I mean, these guys are in need of years and years of therapy. But I got one guy, Musa, to talk about how he was ambushed in the woods. And it's the only lost story I could get someone to actually tell. And it took me 5 hours to actually run through the details and get it. But I thought it was a very valuable story because he actually said, yeah, we lost half our guys right there. And he goes, that was my last battle of the war. At that point, I just went home. And then, of course, you can't really go home when your home is, occupied by Russian troops. And it's also Russia. So he ended up having to escape to another country in which he lives out of Russia now. So I have this little clip. I'm kind of running out of time. This is one thing we had experimented with. I'm just going to play it for you for a second.
Вот весь арсенал, который у них был, они обрушили на Грозный. Город уничтожен был в конце февраля. Чеченские бойцы покинули Грозный. Это 50, наверное. Все, что у нас есть, у нас с собой было. Это тем более было время уразы, когда кушать нельзя. Мы сильно уставшие были. Уже давно не ели толком. И фактически в окружении были все время. Это на Грозный. На этой трассе тоже уже русские войска были. Большой перекресток это. Вот здесь их было слишком много. Здесь Чернореченский перекресток он назывался. Раньше, в советское время, там пост ГАИ был, дорожной полиции. Но там было больше 20 единиц бронетехники там было. Танки, БМП. Но мы не хотели здесь связываться, потому что, во-первых, идти далеко, а во-вторых, слишком много было. А здесь чуть поменьше было. Мы здесь прошли. Вот здесь. Между этим мостом и вот этим перекрестком. Вот здесь вышли. И постоянно мы же не сразу перелезли. Здесь небольшой лес есть. Мы там присмотрелись, постоянно ездит техника. Мы посчитали, что это наиболее удобное место. Эта дорога достаточно широкая. И не прямо на дороге, они чуть-чуть метров 5 от дороги, от трассы. А в БТРе они стояли просто, в смысле охраняли.
I don't know if you could see them. There's one there and one there.
Танки, БМП, там, БТР, постоянно движение было. Мы выждали момент, когда нету. Гранатометчик первым же выстрелом один БТР поджег. Ну и с криком «Аллаху Акбар!» из автомата пулемета стрелять начали, побежали, рванули сюда. И несколько человек там было убито. Второй БТР пустой был. Туда убежали. У этого БТРа, который целый остался, пулемет сюда смотрел. А у этого сюда смотрел. То есть это представляет большую опасность, поэтому его убрали. Надобность была бы, это тоже убрали бы. Но это все заняло буквально 7 минут, не больше. Здесь мы тоже никого не потеряли.
So it's just something we've been experimenting with, trying to build some rough graphics and sort of show and see if it works. Also a good way to verify if things actually don't play out, to try to help correct the story. So it's something we're looking at. But in the end, again, who are these guys? And you can see I have a couple faces here. And the very few of them would let us interview them, but a couple of them did. Isa Manayev, who was the commandant of Grozny, who was in charge of 1,000 Chechen forces who actually, it's interesting. There's 3 Russian obituaries on him. They killed him 3 times, but he's still here. It's interesting. Every time they said they got him, but they just never got him. Abu Bakr, and finally a guy named Khair. And none of these, Isa, with the exception of Isa, these aren't their real names. They're just that afraid because, like I say, Russia's actually going out after these guys. But what we found is, in many cases, is that these guys, some of the guys we interviewed, most of them, some of them, like Isa Manaev, he was a policeman. He ran the internal police before the war and just translated that into running the Grozny Police Department, had 1,000 guys. But guys like Vaca, who became a recon scout, he heard about the war, and he didn't have any money, so he sold his car for 5 assault rifles and some ammunition, and he gave the 4 weapons to his friends, and they went to Grozny, and that's how he became a soldier. And they heard this over and over again. Abu Bakr, they didn't have any money. He walked to Georgia over the mountains. It took him about 4 weeks to get to Tbilisi to sell gold. And he collected gold from his community to buy weapons. Isa was a professional, of course. Hussein was a professional soldier before. Salavli was actually a construction worker who had lived in Russia for most of his life. All of these guys served in the Russian army, the Soviet army if they were old enough to. Aslan was an interesting character, and he was only 15 when the first war started, and 19 when the second war started. And he seemed to be good at tinkering with mines, so they made him a demolition guy. And so he basically had a 5-man team, and they ran IEDs. And I've mentioned him before in other lectures here, where they would just they would try to blow up Russian armor with IEDs. And his 5-man team, he's the only survivor of his 5-man team, and he was actually in a secondary country trying to recruit, and then he was going back in to run counter armor operations in Russia. So again, who are the Chechens, and what's the point? Because I know we have to go. It's a little bit of it. It's everything. Did some of the Chechens become Salafi Wahhabis? Yes, very, very few. But are they all Muslim? Of course. Are they separatists and nationalists? One of the things I would say is it's very much defined by age. And what I mean by that is my generation, the first war generation, is overwhelmingly nationalist separatist. You see it in their dress. They're in third-party countries still, or secondary locations. They're very secular Muslims. That's how I would say. I mean, it's oversimplifying. But if you talk to the younger generation who grew up after 10 years of war, they're a little more, at least in the rhetoric and who they follow. One of the interesting survey questions I asked them was, what do you read, Chechen Press or Kavkaz.net? And the younger generation almost always was into the Kavkaz Center, the more jihadi site. And the older generation was actually either contributing to or strictly followed Chechen Press. So they see themselves differently. It's a mishmash, and as a result, it doesn't actually, there's no cohesiveness. And so in the end, I mean, it's probably inevitable the Russians would win, and I'm not going to say one way or the other whether they should or not, but that's kind of where we're at. But there's still a strong backbone, and why does it matter? Because again, this has helped formulate some of our policies. I mean, we still do. I'll sit through an intelligence briefing prior to a mission in Afghanistan, and I'm not kidding, 50% of the time I will be briefed about the threat of Chechens in the area. Doesn't matter if we're in Helmand province, Paktia province, or Tikrit, Afghanistan. And I just think it's amusing, to say the least. I ran over, so I just want to end here. If anybody has any questions, well, I didn't run over, but I think you only have till 1. So if there's any questions, I'll stop here. And if you guys want to ask me questions, thank you for your attendance. I know some of you have to go. So thanks a lot for showing up.
We'll have time for just a few questions. And actually we've set up, so we'll be screening the Beyond the Border film on Chechnya immediately following the lecture. So if you're interested in staying. Also, I think Beyond the Border, on the website you can find out more information. The library has a set of the films. So you can see more about what we talked about today. Questions? Sure.
Yeah, Dodge, funding's obviously a problem.
Oh, yeah.
What kind of weapons, and where do they get their weapons that they use? Do they steal them from the Russians, or are they comparable in weaponry between the two sides?
Like I said before, in the first war, you have to also set it in perspective. The Russian army in the early 90s was in bad shape. I mean, it was just in bad shape, like Russia in general. The average Russian soldier was malnourished. Hazing was a severe problem in the service. And there was just not that sort of, Russian soldiers sold their weapons to the Chechens all the time for vodka, for money. So a lot of the light weaponry, there was complete parity. Assault rifles all the way up through what they call the Kachavchik, Pretty Boy, the light or medium machine guns, where they couldn't compete with Russians. Obviously, they had 0 air power and they had 0 armor. They would capture, in fact, they towed BTRs from the battlefield occasionally, or BMP. And Solovly, in fact, he had a BTR, it's like his pet. He loved this BTR. But basically, it's a huge Russian target, and every time he'd swing into a battle, the Chechens also thought it was a Russian, so they would also shoot at him too. So he just gave it up, and so they didn't have any heavy weaponry that they could muster up. They had anti-tank rockets, things like that. But they were constantly short on supply. I mean, some of the operations were clearly to get ammunition, and one time they beat the Russians off a hill, and Vaca talks about how the Russians left in a haste and they spilled some ammo crates with 5.45 rounds, and he spent 7 hours combing through the dirt of the trench line and came up with something like 400 and something rounds. But he goes, those rounds were so incredible, that meant I could fight for another 3 days. And so this is a constant problem. Food and weaponry was really hard to come by. The gun you'd have, the rounds you couldn't get. You were almost always, in fact, a number of Chechen casualties were incurred when they would knock out a BTR or a BMP, and they would not try to destroy it, but they want to knock it out, and then they would swarm all over it, and with their knives reach into the hatch, try to pull the Russians out, kill the Russian soldiers, and grab everything they could before the tank or the magazine would blow up, and the BTR, in many cases, they would be blown up with the magazine sometimes and things like that. So there are a lot of casualties in the First War like that. So.
Hi, I just have a question about last year's Moscow Metro bombings and this year's Domodedovo bombing as well. So would you say that these most recent attacks, are they more linked to the kind of the nationalist faction or more to the jihadist faction?
In my opinion, they're almost exclusively the jihadist faction, for the simple fact that the nationalist faction, they're not in Chechnya anymore. There are 35,000 Chechens that live in Germany, and another 30,000 live in Austria, and a big number in Belgium. And they've come to these countries because the Russians aren't as capable of reaching out and taking them out. They first went to Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, and in Slovakia, the Russians were just having a heyday, and the Chechens were just disappearing right and left. A lot of the nationalists have fled. Most of them have fled, in my opinion. I'm sure there are still some there. Doku Umarov, who leads the Chechen group now in the southern mountains, started as a nationalist, but like Shamil Basayev, I think he's certainly adopted the rhetoric of jihadism. And, and since he's the longest living commander, like I say, he fought all from the very beginning in January 95, and he's still alive today, and he runs the show. So it's basically the jihadist group. Because one of the other things you see a real evolution from the First War to the Second War is suicide attacks. Didn't exist in the First War, but it's a prevalent feature in the Second War. So, yeah, I'm not saying, we shouldn't, again, it's funny, I'm maybe point out the obvious, but Chechnya is, and they've declared it an Islamic caliphate, the current people in the mountains, it's supposed to stretch from the Caspian to the Black Sea. In fact, that's one of the problems. Russia will move into preparation for the Winter Olympics in Sochi on the Black Sea. And they're saying, oh, it's safe, don't worry about it. Man, that's one part of the world, I don't know, man. You can make it as safe as you think you can make it, but there's a lot of angst in the North Caucasus, and it's not specifically or uniquely Chechen. There's Cherkesks and Ossetians. In fact, when we went into Chechnya, it's just like a mafia shuttle. The South Ossetian mafia works with the North Ossetian mafia that works with the Ingushetian, that works with the Chechens. So when the Chechens said, we have a package that needs to be delivered, that's basically how we got set up. They said, meet in Skin Valley. So and of course, the Georgians couldn't drive to Skin Valley, so I had a Georgian drive me to the sort of like international peacekeeper line. And we walk across, go into Skin Valley. The South Ossetians pick us up. A bunch of Chechens are there. They go, we need these guys delivered here. Like, what a hassle. But basically, it's keep being handed off to these groups. There's a lot of networks there that are, in fact, if you think of the raid on the school, Beslan School number 1, of the, I think, 22 or 21 hostage takers, two were Chechens. The rest have. So what's happened, the Chechen nationalists have sort of disappeared, and you have got sort of an Islamic caliphate, sort of Islamist sort of agenda stretching across the North Caucasus from elements in Dagestan, Chechnya, Ingushetia. The Ossetians are actually Christian, and then stretching out. So the Olympics in Russia, Sochi, it'll be interesting. It'll be fun. Probably nothing will happen, but it is one place where I would really think you'd want to think twice. That's not good PR for the Olympics. Yes, sir.
Should we care about Chechnya?
You know,
And
I
if
don't.
so, why?
Well, I care about Chechnya for a number of reasons. Yeah, it's a pet project of mine, as you can see. I care about it for a number of reasons. One of the first reasons was, when I watched the events unfold after 9/11 and watched the Russian propaganda machine go after the Chechens globally, and especially and I think there was a lot of deals cut, and it's like, and I don't know this for sure, but it seemed like Putin really laid off us going into Iraq, but all of a sudden we declared a lot of Chechen groups on the terrorist lists. And that's fine and everything, but it's interesting. It plays into so many different things. When Russia attacked South Ossetia in 2008, and we were trying to work with the Chechens, if they just went underground, I went to talk to some of my friends in the Ministry of Defense, Azeri Ministry of Defense, and they were all in a panic. I'm like, what's up? And they said, wow, Russia's just tearing Georgia apart. If the West will not come and support small Christian Georgia, we're doomed as an Islamic country. And it was just sort of this ripple effect through the region. I don't know. I think, why do we care? Well, I think anytime you base, certainly from a military aspect, any sort of like command decision on accurate facts is more important. I mean, I've had, seriously, commanders come and say, we know the Chechens took out this group of Marines. I'm like, why? Because they were all dead in like 2 minutes. I'm like, well, that's flattering to the Chechens. You'd think they could wipe out a squad of Marines in 2 minutes, but there are a lot of good jihadist fighters around the world that could, I'm just saying it doesn't mean that. In other words, there's no real proof that they are. And I think the intel needs to point. Like one of the most recent things 2 years ago was it, a year and a half ago, all the snipers, this came through, all the snipers in Helmand province are Chechen. This doesn't make any sense at all. So I would just like to clean it up a little bit. I mean, I'm not saying the Chechens are sweet guys. They're not. They kill in a rapid, and they kill with the best of them. The ones that are left, certainly if they're not true jihadists, they are certainly by rhetoric are. That's their only support. In the first war, you have to remember, too, they really played to the West. They really hoped to get Western support, and they just didn't get it. But I think about the region and instability in the region and the Chechen. It's critical for the region, for stability in the region. And they've made their presence felt. The war in Abkhazia, the Abkhaz wrote a book. They've taken it off the shelf, practiced their own set of revisionism because they don't want to be tied to the Chechens. But the war in Abkhazia and Georgia, 1992-93, in their own book published from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they credit the Chechens for winning the war. I have a copy of that book. They're like, don't ever show anybody that book. Yeah, I'm like, but you guys all know, but we don't want to be associated with the Chechens now because we're basically, Russia protects us. I mean, it's, their ripple effect goes around. I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, the Jordanians have a huge Chechen population. The Russians threw them out in the Circassian migrations in the 19th century, and they pushed everybody out of the North Caucasus then, or a wave of them, and a lot of them settled in Jordan. And Kadyrov, the current president of Chechnya, who just went down to Jordan and met with a bunch of Chechen school kids, and he was booed. It's interesting, during the war, too, you did see the occasional Turkish, Jordanian, and other nationality, ethnic Chechen or Circassian migrate back to fight the Russians because they were kicked out 3 or 4 generations previous. So it has somewhat of an effect. And you have to remember, like the UAE, they're a good ally of ours in the Gulf, one of the Gulf states, Abu Dhabi, Dubai. They were a huge funder of the Chechens in the first war. Not huge huge by our standards. It's like not even the cost of one Tomahawk. But I mean, they said, they will tell you, yeah, we sent $50 million into the Chechen rebels in the first war, which is so funny. They buy Russian arms all the time, but they kind of like, hey, they're Chechen, they're Muslim, we got to help them where we can. And yeah, we'll buy this, set of BMPs from the Russians, and here's $50 million for the Chechens, and that went a long way to Chechens buy weapons to fight the Russian BMPs. Anyway, so it's kind of interesting how, to me, there's a little bit of it's out there. So we don't have any reason to care as far as our own personal national security or anything like that, I don't think. But as far as our relations with Russia, and the Russian relations with the region, I think it's important. Shevardnadze had tons of problems in Georgia because a lot of the Chechen families were fleeing into the Pankisi Valley because they have cousins there called the Kist people, but they're basically Chechens and they're of the same ethnicity. And of course, a lot of fighters went there just to chill out from Russian bombing too. But you know, this is a big deal because Putin was telling Shevardnadze, if you don't clean up Pankisi, we're going to clean it up for you. And Shevardnadze was completely just like, oh, you know, he didn't want the Russians to invade Georgia back then, so he was able to get an OSCE mission to monitor the borders of Chechnya, Georgia. And so we've had international border monitors up there for about 10 years. I think they're gone now, but they were up there for 10 years. And I spent time with those border monitors watching and you know, through those gorges and there was a lot of traffic. Russian had established positions there, so it affected that. I don't know. And I met somebody from UCOM, which I thought was really interesting not too long ago, who told me he had a task order to wipe out the Chechens in Pankisi should they need to for Georgian security. And I thought, what? I mean, I guess you build these orders up all the, you know, you work with different scenarios, but I'm still waiting for him to get me that order. And he said he can't. It's classified. I'm like, it's old history. Find that order. I want to see this order. I want to see what the plan was. I said, do you think you could take out the Chechens in the Pankisi? He goes, oh yeah, like in a day. I'm like, well, the Russians have been trying for like 10 years, so it might not be as easy as you think. But I go, you realize how many civilians there are in Pankisi? I mean, it's like 50 to 1. The biggest group of Chechen fighters ever in Pankisi that I know about was Goliath's group, and he had 300. But there's 12, 15,000 people in Pankisi. So if you flatten Pankisi, you're just gonna wipe out, 12,000. In other words, it's not. Or you're gonna do a troop assault. So he goes, well, it never came to anything, but we have the order ready to go. So I'm like, that's very interesting to me. Creeps into our foreign policy here and there. I don't know. Good question. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Last question, I guess. Then I can talk afterwards if you guys want. But
so my question is along the lines of, what is your purpose of your book and your documentaries, and why does it matter to the Chechens, or is it even at all for the Chechens?
Well, I pitch it as it's important to the Chechens because I realized a long time ago, following warlords in a lot of places, that if you can appeal to their ego, you can actually get some work done. So that's what I tell the Chechens. I also, I don't know if they get anything out. Some of it need to just go through the venting or the therapy of just walking through it. I mean, for instance, my interviews with Musa lasted for 6 days, which is why I only, part of the reason why I only have 35 really good interviews or 25 is, the good news was when I found somebody, but he wouldn't talk to us at all. It was like, it became like a therapy session for him, and we had to make 2 trips back to see him in the country he's in, because he was really a significant personality, but it took us 6 days of actual to unlock it. What was the other part of your question?
My question was just, what was the purpose of the book?
Oh, the purpose.
Especially, why is it important to that?
Well, again, I am kind of a war geek, and I like to look at battles and the way they're fought, and I've done a lot of work with the Center for Army Lessons Learned. It's a U.S. Army institution, and also Foreign Military Studies Office. And a gentleman there by the name of Les Grau wrote a book called The Other Side of the Mountain, and he looked at Afghan Mujahideen tactics for the Soviet Mujahideen war in Afghanistan. And it was just a series of chapters, like 60 chapters, and he looked at these things in a sort of and he broke it out: ambushes, breaking a cordon, escaping encirclement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that book got me thinking about this book, about that maybe if the Chechens, their myth is way wider than what they actually do, because they just physically don't have the kind of manpower to get to every place in the world they're supposedly at. But I thought they would make an excellent subject matter for this type of a book. So that's how I pitched the book. And I personally don't like writing books that way, in a sense, or I like to see more like a human story, so mine will be a bit different. But in reality, it'll be based around about 50 different combat scenarios. So. And the interesting thing is, that the last thing I will say, I forget to say this, is that I try to verify then everything through a Russian source, so that you get another side to it and clarify. And that's come in particularly handy in like the Battle of Goskaya. There are numerous Russian accounts but they're small. One person, I was in this BTR, and we went in here, and we got surrounded, and 2 guys died, and the BTR commander was shot with a sniper and died instantly. But you start to get a sense of this fight going on. I think it's a good story to tell. Thanks.